The Supreme Court hears oral arguments in the case challenging Donald Trump's emergency tariffs, and most of the justices, not all, but most, seem to doubt their legality for one reason or another. We'll break down the historic argument at the court on Wednesday and what happens if the sweeping tariffs are overturned.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome, I'm Paul Gigot with the Wall Street Journal Opinion Podcast, Potomac Watch here, and I'm with Alicia Finley, who covers the court for us, and Joe Sternberg, who follows international trade and the economy, among other things, but they both follow the court. Welcome to you both. Let's listen to some excerpts from the oral argument that delineates some of the issues in the case. That argument extended for nearly 3 hours. First, let's listen to Justice Elena Kagan ask the Solicitor General John Sauer, who's representing President Trump, about the power to declare an emergency in this case.
You know, we've had cases recently which deals with the president's emergency powers, and it turns out we're in emergencies everything all the time about like half the world.
Well, this particular emergency is particularly existential, as Executive Order 14257 says. And of course, no one disputes the existential nature of the fentanyl crisis, which, you know, we had an agreement last week to create progress on, which illustrates the effectiveness of the tariffs tool here. But the point I would make in response to that is those are, even if there's limited judicial review, which is very natural in the foreign affairs context, this court has always granted the president the presumption that he's acting in good faith. There are real hurdles there, very significant. It's got to be an unusual, extraordinary threat that arises in whole or substantial part outside the United States, so it's entirely foreign-facing into the national security, economy, or foreign policy.
So, Alicia, this emergency point is crucial because the president invoked to impose the tariffs has invoked the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, which says that he can do certain things to regulate foreign commerce if he declares an emergency. And in this case, he's declared them for the trade deficit, which, of course, we've had for 50 years, and the 50 years straight, by the way, and the fentanyl, as John Sauer said, to impose the tariffs on China, Mexico, and Canada. What do you think of this exchange?
Well, first of all, so the law requires a declaration of an emergency, and it actually defines emergency, by the way, as an unusual, quote unquote, unusual threat. And as you point out, we've had a trade deficit for the last 50 years. So that is not unusual. That is actually downright usual. Fentanyl trafficking, yes, it's a serious problem. However, it has also been going on for at least a couple of decades. So that is not unusual or a new serious threat. But this case, at least the way I read the oral arguments, it doesn't seem like the justices are going to try to second guess the president's declaration of what is an emergency or is not an emergency, as Justice Kagan suggested. Well, a president can basically declare anything in an emergency. Are we really going to second guess that? We usually do defer. So the case is going to probably hinge more on a statutory reading or whether the president has the authority under this IEEPA law to impose tariffs, even assuming that there is an emergency.
Joe, the president, though, can, a president, not just Trump, if he declares an emergency under this statute, would have really sweeping powers. And the justices in a couple of spots asked, well, wait a minute, if you could a Democratic president declare an emergency on climate and therefore use tariffs to around the world. And Justice Sotomayor even said, well, could President Biden have declared an emergency on climate to justify his student loan forgiveness? I don't know, maybe on grounds that the climate threat has created so much anxiety among students that they can't repay their loans. Joe, I mean, people laugh, but that's kind of where we are with this stretching the law on emergencies. How do you react?
No, I think that was really, to my ear, a key issue that arose during the oral arguments in this case. Exactly, even if you accept that a president has this wide authority to declare an emergency, even in situations that might not be particularly emergent, what are your limits to act even after you've made that decision. And I think that the key issue that a lot of the justices seem to be thinking about here is the fact that in our constitutional system, the power to tax is very different from the power to do pretty much anything else that the government would do. And I think that an important point, and that doesn't necessarily augur well for President Trump, that the justices were thinking about this, is that our founding fathers, when they wrote the Constitution, hived off the tax power as a particular function that they reserved for Congress. And there were a lot of very good historical reasons for the framers of the Constitution to have done that, and why that distinction has persisted to the current day. And I think that that is very germane to the kind of issue, Paul, that you were raising, and the justices were thinking about things like climate, because taxation is often a policy lever that politicians of all stripes want to pull on in order to achieve various aims. Just within the past few weeks, we had a big debate at the United Nations, at the International Maritime Organization, about a carbon tax on shipping. So I think it's a very live issue in the US right now about whether a president has this back door to claim a unilateral authority to levy taxes on the economy. And it was encouraging to hear that some of the justices seem to be skeptical on that.
Let's listen to Justice Kavanaugh ask the SG on why previous presidents hadn't invoked, haven't found tariffs when they have declared an emergency.
Why do you think presidents Clinton, Bush, Obama have not used IEEPA to impose tariffs on, because there have been trade disputes, and certainly, President Bush, steel imports and the like. Why do you think IEEPA has not been used?
If you look at those 69 emergencies, in fact, you go through them one at a time, which we had our team do, it's really hard to find one where you look at that emergency and you say, oh, tariffs is the natural tool you would use to address that emergency. So, for example, the Blood Diamond emergency, tariffing these sort of, criminal organizations in Africa that are financing terrorism with the sale of diamonds, you don't really tariff them. Or you take, the Iranian hostage crisis. President Carter didn't say, oh, you've seized all of our, embassy personnel, you're holding them hostage, we're going to tariff you.
69 times, no. Tariffs just aren't the natural remedy. But here, yes, this case, absolutely, they're the natural remedy, Alicia. How do you think that played with the justices?
Well, I think that drew a lot of skepticism. One, they obviously aren't the national remedy for fentanyl trafficking, nor for some other. We didn't even mention that he has invoked a national emergency to impose special tariffs on Brazil, claiming that its prosecution of its ex-president, center right President Bolsonaro, is a national emergency, and therefore tariffs is that the natural remedy for that? I don't know. Tariffs are President Trump's household remedy for everything, but that doesn't mean they are a natural remedy for these purported emergencies or purported crises. Now, where I think Justice Kavanaugh was going with this line of questioning is that under the major questions doctrine, the court often looks to the historical precedent, whether other presidents have used or have cited an authority for an executive action. In this case, there hasn't been any. Richard Nixon used an earlier law that was very similar to IEEPA to impose worldwide tariffs of 10% on countries, claiming that basically the breakdown of the Bretton Woods created a balance of payments crisis. But after that, notably, Congress provided a very discrete authority to the president in the 1974 Trade Act, Section 122, to impose tariffs of up to 15% on countries to remedy balance of payments deficits for up to 150 days, and afterwards they must be approved by Congress, which indicates that Congress did not intend a few years later, when it wrote IEEPA, to codify a president's tariff power, especially to remedy trade deficit,
and to allow such sweeping tariffs as the President Trump has imposed. You raised major questions. Let's go there. Let's listen to the major questions doctrine is Supreme Court precedent that says that when the executive branch acts through regulation, for example, or other mandates to the major action that implicates large part of the economy, has a large significance, it must have the express authority of Congress. And that's why whether or not the statute allows tariffs in this case is such a crucial part of this. And let's listen to Chief Justice Roberts question the SG about it.
Some time ago, you dismissed the applicability of the major questions doctrine, and I want you to explain that a little bit more. I mean, it seems that it might be directly applicable. You have a claim source, an IEPA, that had never before been used to justify tariffs. No one has argued that it does until this particular case. Congress uses tariffs in other provisions, but not here. And yet, and correct me on this if I'm not right about it, the justification is being used for a power to impose tariffs on any product from any country in any amount for any length of time. That seems like, I'm not suggesting it's not there, but it does seem like that's major authority, and the basis for the claim seems to be a misfit. So why doesn't it apply again?
Well, we agree that it's a major power, but it's in the context of a statute that is explicitly conferring major powers, that the point of the statute is to confer major powers to address major questions.
Well, major power, but not a major question. That's an interesting distinction. And of course, he says that the statute specifies it, Joe, but here's the issue that the Chief in another, elsewhere in the argument, point he made, which is that tariffs are taxes, and taxes are expressly reserved in the Constitution for Congress. So how come the president here, if there's not the word tariffs in the statute, how the president can impose those taxes?
It's been a sort of contradiction that the administration and President Trump have been struggling with as this entire case has been grinding along, because in the way that the president talks about the tariffs to the American public, it's all about the big revenues that it's bringing in and the significance of that for the budget and the enormous effect that it's having on America's trading position in the economy. And then you get into the Supreme Court oral argument, and the argument is basically, well, the tariffs are one of many tools allowed by this law. And, in fact, it's such a relatively small thing that the Congress didn't even think to mention this explicitly when they wrote the law. Because, the administration is now trying to sneak in this enormously transformative economic policy of these huge tariffs that Trump has imposed over since his inauguration, trying to sneak those in sort of between a comma and a space here and there in the text of this legislation, where it isn't at all obvious that Congress ever intended to go so far as to confer this tariff power. And I mean, going to this underlying argument about major questions, there's a very good reason that Congress wouldn't have done that, because as soon as you're talking about an issue of taxation, and the tariff is a tax on Americans, you get into this whole host of complicated political economy issues, balancing various interests against each other. And historically, we have been very suspicious of allowing any one individual in our system to make that kind of decision. You can make a good case that there are solid reasons that Congress would have wanted to keep that power for itself.
The administration's defense on major questions, the other defense, the reason it says it's off the table is because this is a foreign policy power, that tariffs implicate foreign policy. And under Article 2, which deals with the presidency and the Constitution, this foreign policy is enormous power is allocated to the president, and therefore major questions doesn't apply. That seems to be where some of the conservatives, justices, may come out, Alicia.
Well, I think we earlier heard, and Justice Sotomayor was kind of skeptical of that and raised the question, well, then could have Biden just claimed climate change because global warming, and that's clearly a foreign-facing issue. Could he have just claimed climate change to justify his student loan forgiveness, and that would have prevented the Supreme Court from reviewing and striking down his $400 billion write-off? And the Solicitor General didn't really have a good answer for that. And then Justice Neil Gorsuch later on raised the question, well, okay, could a president use, again, climate change or global warming as a justification to impose 50% tariffs, which are essentially, again, taxes on gas-powered cars? And the Solicitor General conceded that yes, they could. As long as you find some kind of claim or that there's a foreign-facing problem, maybe there's human rights violation in another country or something rather, then the court cannot provide or scrutinize an executive's overreaches.
And this gets to the very significant point about this case, which is really not just about President Trump's tariff policy. This is about this is a case for the ages about presidential authority vis-a-vis Congress and its ability to impose taxes. And on that point, I want to listen to an exchange between Justice Gorsuch and the SG on something called the non-delegation doctrine, which is a rarely invoked doctrine these days, but essentially says that relies on some language in the Constitution that says Congress cannot delegate its powers without an intelligible principle to anyone else. And let's listen to that.
Because you say we shouldn't be concerned because this is foreign affairs and the president has inherent authority, and so delegation off the books, more or less.
Or
and if that's true, what would prohibit Congress from just abdicating all responsibility to regulate foreign commerce? For that matter, declare war to the president?
We don't contend that he could do that. If it did,
why not?
Well, because we're dealing with a statute again that has a whole.
I'm not asking about the statute, General. I'm not asking about the statute. I'm asking for your theory of the Constitution and why the major questions of non-delegation, what bite it would have in that case.
Yes, I would say by then you would move from the area where there's enormous deference to the president, actually both the political branches, where here there's inherent authority, and piled on top of that there's a broad delegation.
You're saying there's inherent authority in foreign affairs, all foreign affairs. So regulate commerce, duties, and tariffs and war. It's inherent authority all the way down, you say. Fine. Congress decides tomorrow, well, we're tired of this legislating business. We're just going to hand it all off to the president. What would stop Congress from doing that?
That would be different than a situation where there are metes and bounds, so to speak. It would be a wholesale application.
You say we are not here to judge metes and bounds when the foreign affairs. That's what I'm struggling with. You'd have to have some test. And if it isn't the intelligible principle test or something more with more bite than that, you're saying it's something less.
This, of course, has been a long time theme of Justice Gorsuch, going back to his time as a lower court judge, that he believes he would love to resurrect the non-delegation doctrine as a more formidable doctrine, Alicia. So very interesting exchange. I think, as I listen to this, that's what's going to bring Gorsuch, that and major questions are going to bring Gorsuch over to oppose the president's tariffs. What do you think?
I agree. It's interesting because the other conservatives on the court, or Justice Alito and Thomas, have also signed on to some concurring opinions, suggesting a revival of this non-delegation doctrine. And I say revival because it really hasn't been used by the Supreme Court for 100 years, going back to the 1930s. Instead, the court has settled many of these major questions by using the major questions doctrine. It was also interesting during the oral arguments, you heard, I think, Kagan almost kind of bait or provide kind of some bait with Alito and Thomas, noting that they signed on to a dissent in a case last this last term, FCC v. Consumer Research, that involved a non-delegation question, and it also involved the power of taxation. They were very, I don't want to say strident, but they were very strong. Yes, in saying that the Congress cannot delegate its taxing power without any kind of, or without a very specific intelligible limit, which in my view they did in that case, but they were in the dissent. So I think the Kagan was a little bit trying to hoist them on their own targets there.
Oh, I think there's no question she did. She's smart, but this gets to the point, Joe, where I come out on this case when it comes to the court and its credibility. I mean, this court, conservative court, has had several things it's tried to do, right? One is it's tried to restore the proper separation of powers among the three branches of government. In particular, tried to revive congressional authority vis-a-vis the executive branch. And and it's also stipulated that it believes in the field, the text. Follow the text. Follow the statute. And if something's not in the statute, then you can't do it. And tariffs aren't in the statute. The word regulate is, but does regulate include tariffs? I would argue no. And so the point being that if this court for some reason would uphold the Trump tariffs, it would be going against a whole long list of cases and priorities that it has made a mission over the last decade.
Yeah. I mean, this court has been at its strongest and has been, performed its greatest services for our political life in those times when it has told everyone to stay in their constitutional lanes, because that is a mechanism of going back and making sure that we are allowing the political process to work out in a way that makes it possible for us to govern a country that is as large and complicated as America. And I think that there's a constitutional design there that's effective at doing that if we'll let it. And I mean, on this point, I just want to point out, a relevant line of questioning here from a couple of the justices who seemed a bit more sympathetic to the Trump administration was that the tariffs are working. They have succeeded in bringing other governments to the table and allowing the president to negotiate new trade deals with various partners, and that this was offered as sort of maybe a justification for this foreign policy argument. I think the key point to remember there, though, is that because we are talking about a tax, there's a real cost-benefit analysis that you have to run there. There's a real question about whether the cost to the U.S. economy is worth whatever benefits we may or may not be getting out of some of these trade deals. And we've discussed whether some of those deals are actually worth the trouble that we've gone through to get them. And that is fundamentally a political question that the Congress is well set up to deal with. I mean, that's at the heart of any kind of taxing and spending legislation they do. Is the pain of the taxation worth whatever benefit that we're getting out of it? And I would really hope that ultimately the justices heed, Justice Gorsuch and some of his wisdom about the virtue of staying in your lane when you are dealing with that kind of issue, and you're returning that kind of taxing authority to the Congress that is best equipped to deal with a bunch of this trading off.
All right, let's read the tea leaves, Alicia, of the oral argument, and what do you think this is, where this is going to come out?
I think it's going to be a 7-2 decision with Alito and Thomas in the dissent. I think Kavanaugh sounded like he was a little bit on the fence because of this precedent, the Algonquin decision, 1976, that involved actually a different law, Section 232 law, that didn't include direct authority to impose tariffs, but allowed the president to adjust imports.
So that would allow him to join the dissenters. When you say dissent from an opinion that
the
would
majority.
overturn the tariffs.
Right, but I think he has also been very strong on the major questions doctrine, and I think if the Chief Justice, it sounded very much so that he was going to strike down the tariffs. I think Brett Kavanaugh would probably lean with the Chief as well.
Okay, so you're going to get the three liberals, Sotomayor, Jackson, and Kagan. They're going to they're going to vote to overturn the tariffs. Sounds like the Chief is there. Sounds like on major questions. Sounds like Gorsuch is there on major questions and non-delegation. That gets you 5. All right. Alito and Thomas seem to be most in the president's camp on this. Maybe on the foreign policy argument, maybe on the tariffs are working argument, maybe on the deference to the president on emergency powers. I don't know how they square that textual language about tariffs, but it'll be interesting to see, and not in the statute, but interesting to see how they go. That leaves Kavanaugh, who's on the fence, and Barrett. And Barrett seemed highly skeptical of the tariffs on statutory grounds, but she did ask some questions like Kavanaugh did on the statute itself. So she might have to go on major questions as well.
I think that's right. But I think both of them, whenever major questions, I mean, granted, most of them, I thought, the major questions cases that have come up, in my view, have been no-brainers, but they've been very strong. Both of them have been strong on those. Yeah,
that includes the student loan Biden decision. All right. So we've got, I think it should be 9-0 myself, but okay, 7-2, you're probably right. All right, Joe, let's talk about just briefly about the implications of this. Trump says, I think he said yesterday, that if his tariffs are overturned as emergency tariffs, this would be very destructive to the U.S. economy. What do you think the impact for the economy would be?
I think it would actually be pretty positive for the economy, and investors seem to agree, because as news of this oral argument was coming out on Wednesday afternoon, and Wall Street was digesting what direction the justices seemed to be heading, equities seem to have perked up a bit. So I think that this doesn't immediately solve the Trump protectionist problem, because there are other legal provisions that would allow a president to impose tariffs, but none so sweeping as the authority that Trump has claimed under IEPA, and those also come with a more characteristic or traditional approach of the Commerce Department or somebody has to do a study of the market, and then you have this extended process. That is a known unknown for the business world. What has really been killing them has been the unknown of the Trump as tariff man getting out there, and you never know when you wake up in the morning what the tariff rate is going to be when you go to bed that night. So I think that it's good for the economy if we can inject a bit more certainty into trade policy, at least by taking the unilateral tariff authority off the table, forcing the president to go through these established legal channels if he does want to engage in protectionism. So I think that it's going to be a fiscal hit, because there would be this question of what Treasury has to do with the tariff revenue it has already collected. It's going to be very politically embarrassing for the president, because he's invested a lot in the tariff strategy. Might also end up being the best thing that happens to him in this administration if it removes this cloud that has been hanging over the economy the past few months.
And if it leads to fewer price increases on goods that are imported, because as we saw in the elections on Tuesday, the voters are still very, very concerned about prices and inflation, Alicia. So we are going to leave it at that for today. Thanks, Joe. Thanks, Alicia. And boy, we're watching this case with great interest, and we shall see where it goes. Thanks for listening. We're here every day on Potomac Watch.